Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy and glad to see so many people here, and so many people. It's really reassuring to see that so many people are interested in the fate and future of the city and of Albania more generally. I'm going to be giving a few inputs on housing affordability and informality. This will be a little bit of a transition towards some of the other speakers, so it'll be a little bit more of a horizontal treatment of these topics because they are interrelated. In which way we'll be able to share some of the insights that we've gained through our own studies and work, and possibly transition into a deeper treatment through the work of my colleagues. So when we're talking about informality and housing, typically speaking, it really comes down to a matter of access and affordability. There's more or less two kind of schools of thought when it comes to housing. So the first, or the idealistic school of thought, is that housing is a human right. As planners and architects, you know, we tend to be idealists. We're kind of cultivated and raised with this idea that we're all going to change the world, and you know, under ideal circumstances that would be the case. But the practical or pragmatic reality is that housing, over being a human right, is actually also a market commodity, especially in the kind of economic system which we inhabit. So more physically speaking, housing is a kind of physical infrastructure that has an associated cost to it. And the logistics of who actually is responsible for bearing this cost and how this cost is kind of structured says a lot. It's kind of a litmus test or an analysis of the society in which we're currently sort of inhabiting. So it reflects social norms, it reflects cultural norms, the economics, but also the history of a place. Now, as these factors change, of course, you know, as we move from perhaps more social systems to more free market capitalist systems, we're going to see, in proportion, a kind of change in the housing policies and in the level of affordability that's possible. Now, for the case of Albania, Albania is quite interesting. You know, we went from perhaps the most progressive kind of socialist regime and dictatorship in all of Europe, by some kind of critics and opinion makers, sort of the North Korea of Europe, to a very kind of Western-facing capitalist free market economy. And this kind of very harsh transition, it was also reflected in the development of the housing situation or context over the past 30 years. So I'll give just a bit of a background. I'm sure that, you know, many of us here are Albanian, and many of us have kind of either grown up during the last phase of communism or have heard from it from our parents and grandparents. But in a very kind of simplistic format, because of course the topic is very multifaceted and diverse, we've kind of broken down the history of affordable housing, which is also a history of informality, incidentally, into three stages. So the first stage was, of course, the socialist stage from 1945 to 1990. Housing was provided by the state through a form of rental. There wasn't really an affordability strategy to speak of because it wasn't something that was really kind of budgeted on an individual basis. And of course, from a spatial perspective, where we select housing and where we choose to live, of course, has huge implications on the price and the services that are available and the opportunities that are available to us. But in communism, because, of course, you were restricted, internal migration basically prevented us from kind of seeking other forms of housing unless that was something that was sort of dictated by the party apparatus. And the regulatory environment, of course, in the dictatorship is quite strong. So everything is bound by rules. Informality is something that's sort of addressed with very, very harsh kind of repercussions in such a way that it's stamped out fundamentally. As we all know, the beginning of the transition, starting from 1990, began with a housing reform, which for much of Eastern Europe kind of gave the local populations a bit of a head start in terms of, you know, having something, some kind of property or some kind of house which was transferred from the public property to a private property. It was transferred to their ownership, so they had an apartment or perhaps a place on the cooperative which they could engage in the housing market. So the housing was provided initially through this housing reform, and then eventually as the economy started to take off and people accumulated a bit of capital, then the free market development, which we're currently sort of living in, began to establish itself as the paradigm. Now, the affordability strategy, of course, for those people that were so lucky and so privileged that they had housing close to or near the amenities, services, and economies which provided the best opportunities within Albania, which was mostly in the capital. Affordability was not too much of an issue at first. However, a large part of the population of Albania was rural, and there was a large amount of internal migration, which, because of the lack of rules and regulations, kind of manifested in the form of informal settlements, basically ballooning or expanding the center of the city to kind of over a period of 10, 20, 30 years to encompass what we currently know as Albania, which is, of course, not just the city core, but also the suburbs, which are now kind of fully integrated and legalized. The regulatory environment, of course, because the transition was so sudden and sharp, was weak, but of course it was increasing as more rules and regulations and laws were kind of put in place to ensure that everything was kind of running according to the rule of law. And in the present, we no longer have the housing reform. That was a one-time thing which the people of the time benefited from. We're fully in the capitalist free market ship. There are currently social housing policies which help to kind of address this issue of affordability. And at the same time, we're seeing a transition from these sort of harsh, visible, physical forms of informality, which were the settlements or the squatter settlements of which we speak of so often, towards more informal or, dare I say, westernized, more sophisticated forms of informality, which are tied to using the existing kind of physical infrastructure and modifying it in such ways in which we can kind of extract value both as renters and owners. So of course the regulatory environment is stronger now, hence why we can't really engage in that degree of informality that we could before. So I'll just go through the housing policies very quickly because the previous matrix, of course, was quite detailed. When it comes to affordability, and then I'll go into informality. When it comes to affordability, there's two kind of main documents at the national level, which kind of determine the sort of predicted or anticipated policies and the actual programs which are responsible for sort of taking some of the pressure off some of the more vulnerable populations. So the first, of course, is the law on social housing, which is on which was drafted and approved in 2018. This kind of sets the criteria and definitions on what actually constitutes social housing. It's an important distinction to make, which we'll probably focus on a little bit during the discussion. When we're talking about affordable housing, in Albania, affordable housing is not really a term that is included within the legislation itself. We do have low-cost housing, but it's always treated in the manner or the venue of social housing. So there's certain groups which are given kind of preferential treatment towards accessing these kinds of policies. And of course, there's a social housing strategy which kind of reflects some of those criteria and tries to set a kind of practical roadmap towards ensuring that the housing needs for these socially vulnerable parts of the population can be met. So the list of strategies is quite complex and comprehensive. There's assistance in terms of rental, assistance in terms of ownership, there's infrastructure upgrading, there's subsidies, there's soft mortgages and loans, and there's also small housing grants which may be used for reconstruction or other forms of upgrading of the facilities. However, what we find in practice and what we've seen is that typically the two most common forms or the most prevalent policies are the rent controls and the soft mortgages. So the soft mortgages are essentially kind of low interest loans. Now, while this strategy is quite comprehensive, these measures themselves are not kind of implemented to a sufficient enough scale to really make a substantial or meaningful dent. So this is really a work in progress, and these are really a limited buffer when it comes to improving the affordability of Albania's kind of real estate market. So our proposal is kind of that informality in and of itself can also be seen as an affordable housing strategy. In the absence of, let's say, a regulatory framework or a very clear way of maintaining and ensuring sufficient living conditions for people at an affordable price, what typically tends to happen, both for living and for infrastructure, is that a problem that can't be handled by the powers that be, let's say, is taken into the hands of the individuals, and the individuals kind of make do with what they have. Of course, when it comes to housing itself, if there is a change in the supply or the demand, what happens is that that's typically met with issues of affordability, economics 101. Now, in 1990, after the transition, what we saw in Tirana was kind of the cropping up of these informal settlements and also in some additional cities, up to the point where we have perhaps a fourth of Albania's urban population living in these what were previously informal settlements, because a lot of them have currently been legalized. So the initial response and the initial informality that cropped up after the fall of socialism was a necessary, let's say, a necessary way of dealing with internal migration and not having the kind of infrastructure and regulatory framework necessary for providing, let's say, lawful or legal forms of housing and shelter for these people. Differently from other forms of informality, and the informality that a lot of us have kind of seen in case studies in the global south, in Albania, the physical form of it is actually quite impressive and, dare I say, posh. So instead of having these very kind of squalid living conditions, what we typically have are these high-quality multi-story villas, which were located on the outskirts of the city, the rural outskirts, with great views on the hills, completely detached, and in some cases much more impressive than the kind of state-sponsored housing that people would receive through the socialist regime. Now, over the past 15, 20 years, what we've seen is that the critical mass achieved by these informal settlements was such that they had real bargaining and negotiating power, and it wasn't so simple and so politically expedient, nor even, dare I say, moral, to remove large proportions of these population from their housing which they had kind of incrementally built and took a kind of valid form. Though, of course, there were problems in terms of providing the infrastructure. They had enough negotiating power and enough mass where legalization was really the only policy through which they could proceed. And as we see on the bar graphs underneath, we see large numbers of the increase in the number of permits, legalization permits, which were given year by year. So we've kind of moved past that, and that was a chapter of Albania which has mostly been closed. Of course, the repercussions can only be known in retrospect. But what we know is that the territory now currently has been more or less regulated, and the institutional and legal capacities for formalizing and legitimizing this form of previous informal settlement pattern has been put in place. So when we speak of informality now, more and more we're going to be talking about the informality that arises as a result or as a consequence the fact that housing affordability still does tend to continue to be an issue for, especially for the capital, because that demographic trend where people are moving to the capital continues, and it continues unabated, despite the fact that all of the structures have kind of been put in place. There's a bit of a saying, I guess, within my generation where if not abroad, then in Tirana. So I think that kind of sets a very clear vision on how the current working generation, the millennials, perhaps kind of conceptualize their economic futures in relation to Albania. The demand, of course, is very high. Real estate prices, for many reasons, including all of the investments that have been made and all of the branding and all the talk of Albania as the next kind of big thing, are increasing. And the city continues to kind of suburbanize and expand, but at the same time, incomes, as in most places of the world, have kind of remained stagnant. So what we will likely see is more of a transition, as I said, to essentially using the existing housing stock and finding ways, architecture and form ways to squeeze out more value out of it, and by the same token kind of create this opportunity for affordable housing. So, for example, we might have a lot of these, let's say, these previously informal settlements, these 2-, 3-story, 4-story villas, they have a lot of space, and the demographics of the owners or the people living there may have changed because they may have been in their 30s when they first built it in the 1990s. Now they're retired, the kids are abroad, so you have all of this space, it's grandma and grandpa. Perhaps, there's the opportunity to kind of reuse or adapt these spaces in such a way as to perhaps create some more rental square meters or more usable surface area for rentals, which will, of course, in a certain kind of way, it artificially increases the housing stock and can perhaps help to mitigate some of the challenges in providing affordable housing. I'll talk very quickly about one more kind of pathway, something to kind of consider when we're talking about the solutions to affordable housing, or the strategies that we might kind of give some thought to. I think it's quite important because the topic itself is not something that can be easily solved. So incremental solutions, even a drop in the ocean can make all the difference to a single family or a small community. So I think it's really important to consider other frameworks which could perhaps provide some precedents for building affordable housing. So one example, which unfortunately was kind of a byproduct of a very tragic occurrence, was the reconstruction that happened as a result of the earthquake which hit Albania in 2019. The number of casualties, of course, was high, 51 casualties, 13,000 families displaced, 11,000 homes destroyed, and more than close to 100,000 buildings were damaged. And of course, this creates an immediate problem when it comes to providing sustainable and affordable housing. Now, the caveat here is that reconstruction itself did receive quite a lot of aid, both from foreign and local donors. It did have a very large effect on Albania, which was perhaps further compounded by the fact that a year later or a few months later, we were under a total lockdown because of the COVID crisis. But at the same time, the government has kind of moved to introduce measures to reshelter or rehouse a lot of those people that were affected. So there was a map there. Unfortunately, we can't see it anymore. Now, as part of our work at the planning agency, what we were personally responsible for was kind of drafting the master plans for facilitating this reconstruction in 41 different areas located within 9 municipalities. So quite a hectic undertaking. The majority of them were drafted in 2020. Of course, the process lasted a little bit longer because we were tasked with coordination and organization of the drafting of these master plans, and that can take a long time until, let's say, the politics or the conditions are proper for this. Now, the really interesting part about this is that the obligatory local plans themselves in the planning legislation include parameters that go beyond the general local plans. So under the case of an extraordinary circumstance, we do have a kind of legal mechanism through which we can facilitate the creation of more housing, whether it be through different densities or whether it be through overlooking and bypassing certain criteria, which may make it more difficult from an urban planning perspective to build affordable housing. So as a result of this initiative, of course it's an ongoing initiative, the housing stock is being rebuilt. Other people were provided with compensation. And this was perhaps a first step in Albania ensuring that first experience in finding other ways of creating housing very quickly to deal with an emergency. So these are some of the results in different villages. As you can kind of see, it's an interesting kind of irony that, you know, we go from centrally planned to very informal and perhaps a wide diversity of visual forms to something that clearly came from a very kind of top-down kind of approach master plan. So yeah, I think the conclusions are that you know, as we move from one political system to the next and we kind of integrate ourselves more with the EU, the affordability will continue to be an issue. Of course, legitimization and legalization defined informality in the 1990s. Now we're looking at informality, which is closer to what we might see in larger European capitals. And disaster resilience, sustainability, all of these terms, more than keywords, I think they should really help us to think about these issues in ways in which we can kind of figure out solutions to provide housing, even in cases where it's not an emergency.